Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today, we're heading to the mouth of the Columbia River, one of the most dangerous river entrances in the world. The mix of river, ocean, wind, storms, and shifting sands here have caused so many thousands of shipwrecks over the centuries that it's become known as the graveyard of the Pacific. These days, Astoria, Oregon is a tourist destination, but the coastline is still dangerous.
In two separate incidents, 3 are killed in the rough ocean water, but 5 saved after their fishing boats capsized near the mouth of the Columbia River.
If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It's a great companion to this conversation, and you can find the video in the show notes. But for now, batten down the hatches. Canute, when Lewis and Clark, after their long journey across the continent, finally made it to this river they were looking for and finally made it to the mouth of the river, the Columbia, what did they find?
Well, of course, they got there in November of 1805, and the weather was miserable. You know, and they're coming down the old Columbia River, which means rapids, waterfalls, treacherous places, portages.
Not some of the placid lakes behind dams that we know.
That's right. There's no Lake Roosevelt or whatever. And, they're lucky they didn't come like a millennia or a few millennia before, because the mouth of the river used to be 40 or 50 miles further out when there was more land. So, what they found was a wild Pacific coast. There's actually a place near Astoria, but on the Washington side. It's now a roadside landmark called Dismal Nitch.
How descriptive.
Yeah, they were almost to the mouth of the river when they got hit by a big storm. They had to beach their canoes, and they just found a kind of niche, a break in the rocks on the shore, and huddled in there for a week. And they were cold and miserable, and that's Clark put in his journal. It was a dismal little niche that they got stuck in. But this is pretty typical of explorers and others who came to the mouth of the Columbia in those early days.
They were hardly the first Euro or Euro-American explorers to find and explore the mouth of the Columbia. Who else was there, and what did they find?
So in the late 18th century, whalers and others discovered that there was a lucrative market in fur, and great interest developed in the sea otter fur trade on Vancouver Island, which is where it first developed. And this is happening at a time when multiple European and American empires are seeking to get a foothold on the West Coast, partly because the Pacific trade was going to be so important. And so you had the British were sending people to explore, American traders and people, operating maybe outside of legal lines in order to get access. You had Spanish had claims here, and the Russians had claims. The Russians, were in Alaska, but they were as far south as Northern California in terms of fur trade. So you had all these competing groups, and, finding the mouth of this river of the West was an important piece of the puzzle. Where was it? Did it exist at all? So you had the Spanish coming up, Bruno Heceta, who found the mouth of the Columbia. He just didn't know it was the mouth. He thought maybe it was a bay. And then it was an American, Robert Gray, who actually figured out, no, this is the mouth of a very big river. His ship was named the Columbia. He named the river Columbia. And that gave Americans, the sort of finding rights, as it were. Then Captain George Vancouver, who in 1792 was out here exploring Puget Sound, exploring the Washington coast, trying to figure it out. He had sailed right by it. And when he heard that Robert Gray had discovered it, just shortly before, he turned around and sent a sloop, went about 100 miles upriver, and this was the basis for British claiming. So you had multiple people interested, multiple people trying to establish presence there, and it was the British and Americans that really sunk the roots in.
And multiple people that missed it entirely.
Yes, exactly. I mean, today it's an obvious thing, but when you're in a sailing ship of the 18th century, you're offshore, you're worried about getting tossed onto the rocks and or fog or mist or whatever. There are a lot of reasons that they weren't able to kind of establish what it was. But it's fascinating just in retrospect to see like how difficult it was. And the great monument to that is, this big bluff, this big towering cliff there, and there's a lighthouse on top of it. But Mears named it Cape Disappointment because at the entrance of the river, because he was so disappointed in not finding a river there.
Oh, another inspiring name. First there's Dismal Nitch, then Cape Disappointment.
Right.
Why all the gloom?
Yeah, why all the gloom? Well, this just gets to the problematic nature of the river's mouth and what people wanted to use it for, and the technology of the time. And they didn't have the skills that indigenous people had who had lived there for a long time and knew the ins and outs and danger points and whatnot of the river. These guys are basically seamen who are trying to figure out how to penetrate into the interior. You want to go back on the trail?
No, let's go back on the trail. Get down.
Well, you and your team spent some time down in Astoria and the mouth of the Columbia. Are there any more dismal names to report?
Well, one of the things we did was we were seeing whether or not we could actually do a shoot up at the top of Cape Disappointment where there's a lighthouse. There's a trail that goes up there.
So I think the lighthouse is just up there.
And on that trail, on the way, you pass a very picturesque little cove on the north side called Dead Man's Hollow or Dead Man's Cove, named after a drowning victim, a shipwreck victim that washed up there.
They found bodies here, you think?
A body at least, yeah. Somebody from a shipwreck that washed in here, which is how it got its name, but it may be more than one.
And then, of course, when you get to the top of the bluff where the lighthouse is, you get an amazing view of the mouth of the Columbia from the north. And then you can also look further up the coast to the north and see the sort of, rugged Washington coast and beaches and that kind of thing. It's a very dramatic, viewpoint.
You can see the bridge, Astoria Bridge way down there.
I was actually disappointed in Cape Disappointment. I mean, the view is fantastic. The hike up there is invigorating.
I think I could stagger the rest of the way. I don't push it too hard.
I've been there before. It's fabulous, but it was disappointing from a technical standpoint because we just couldn't find a way to get all of our equipment up there and do the kind of setup that we wanted to do.
I mean, the issue is that, we're not going to do this hike. We're not going to schlep this.
Right.
It's a little too much.
It was just one of those things that, it looks great from a distance, but once you're up there, you're not getting what you wanted in terms of ease of being able to cart your cameras and stuff around.
Well, that's funny because that's what many a ship captain said, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
It looks nice, but how do I get there?
Yeah, it's a schlep.
Yeah. Speaking of disappointment, why is it called the Graveyard of the Pacific? What is the extent of the shipwrecks that happened there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that just adds to the gloomy sort of history. So, I mean, the Columbia River is moving fast, huge volumes of water coming down.
Especially then.
Well, yes, before the dams. It's more controlled now, but it's still a significant force It's moving sand and gravel down the river in huge proportions, which build up and create a bar there. And so it was difficult to get into the Columbia because of the sandbars, and you had to find a way through. And of course, in the beginning, we're talking about the days of sail. The coast is also very rugged. There are lots of storms. There's strong tides. And with the mouth of the Columbia, I've read it described as essentially you have waves that are coming across thousands of miles of ocean, picking up speed and momentum. And then they get to this shallow mouth of the Columbia because of the bar, and it crashes into that and creates it's been described as a kind of cauldron. You've got water going every which way. So you have the river flow going out, you have tides going in and out, you have sand building up and shifting, and then you have a lot of just weather. I've been in Astoria where literally there was snow in the morning, sunshine in the afternoon, and a gale at night. It's very changeable on the coast, and it can, happen at various times of the year, plus fog. So it's very tricky, and certainly in the days of sail, it's even trickier because you don't have sonar, you don't have radar, you don't have radios, you're subject to the winds. But even when they came along in the steam and diesel engine, it still creates an environment that's very unpredictable and very treacherous. So one way to kind of get a sense of it is at the Maritime Museum in Astoria. We went there as part of our kind of doing research and scouting the area while doing the episodes.
But this does a good job of at least giving a little, picture of the destructiveness.
And the scale of the destruction of vessels of all kinds is really incredible.
So we're looking at a 3D map.
They have this huge kind of floor-to-ceiling map that shows the mouth of the Columbia and the adjacent river and the adjacent coastline.
They're little white sailboats with like a broken mast. And they represent just some of the hundreds of shipwrecks that have taken place just to the north and south of the mouth of the Columbia.
We know, for example, that as early as the late 1500s, there was a Spanish shipwreck. We did an episode, a Mossback episode, about the so-called beeswax wreck. Now, that took place south, but it was a ship that came over and was driven onto the rocks and the beach while coming from the Philippines. There's evidence that there may have been other trading vessels as well as Japanese and others who came over. And then with settlement, with exploration, then you get a much higher level of disaster because there's so many vessels coming, trying to get over the bar without the technology and the management of the river that we have today. And so it comes by its name very honestly.
What are some of the dramatic shipwrecks? I'm imagining there's lots of incredible dramatic stories of these ships and what happened.
Yeah. So one of the shipwrecks that we focused on, the writer Cole Thrush, who wrote Native Seattle and many other books, he has a book coming out about shipwrecks in the Northwest. It takes in a much bigger scope. But I got in touch with him and I said, is there one wreck in particular that is like the signature wreck of the graveyard of the Pacific? And he said, yeah, it's the General Warren.
Here it is, 1852, the ship pounded to pieces by the surf. 42 lives were lost.
And this was a steamboat that was taking passengers to San Francisco in January. At this point, there were Columbia River pilots, people who were trained to know where the passages through the sandbars were. At the mouth of the Columbia, it gets over the bar. It just encounters terrible weather.
It was getting dark. There was a storm. And so they headed back.
And they don't make it. They get driven onto Clatsop Spit, which is the sandy beach at the southern side of the mouth. And they put a bunch of guys, crewmen, into a boat and send it to get help in Astoria.
But in the meantime, everyone else on the General Warren was killed.
Bodies are washing up days later. The only people who survived were the guys in the lifeboat. It had this chilling effect, I think, because it wasn't a bunch of professional sailors, you know. It was settlers. It was their families. It was people who were going about kind of ordinary business.
I went back and looked at the newspaper accounts, and they're quite detailed and very, it was a huge tragedy at the time.
These boats were sort of like little islands of civilization, and it was just like matchsticks.
It really established the reputation of this graveyard of the Pacific.
Are there any shipwrecks that are still visible?
Yes, there's one in particular, which is also on Clatsop Spit. It's called the Peter Iredale.
Wow.
It's pretty cool, isn't it?
And this is a vessel that came in the early 20th century, and it was, headed up the Columbia. It had, I think, brought lumber and was picking up grain, but it got caught in bad weather and ended up being driven up on Clatsop Spit. And nobody died in the Peter Iredale, but the ship was built of metal and wood, right? And you can still see the wreck on the beach. There's this thing that looks like a giant modern sculpture, which is the skeleton of the bow of the Peter Iredale.
Am I imagining that this is part of the bow somehow?
That's what it looks like.
Seems to come to a point there.
And then buried in the sand is part of the rest of the wreck. And as you walk kind of along the beach, you see bits of it sticking out.
The fact that it hasn't been battered to death and hasn't completely rusted away, that it's enough of a fixture that they can put it on signs and on your navigation system. It's pretty amazing.
It's a tourist attraction. It was a tourist attraction in 1906. Apparently, when it wound up on the beach, people went down and salvaged and scavenged everything that they could get off this wreck. And then people started coming out by rail and having picnics on the beach and looking at this wreck. From the get-go, it was like it had entertainment value. And it just amazes me that given the power of the Pacific, that this wreck is so embedded there that it's still there.
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch of vehicles.
We went down and scouted it and saw that, you can drive on the beach there in Oregon. You have to drive in a place where the sand is kind of compact and whatnot. And we thought that, well, this will be great. We'll come back. We'll film me standing up in front of the Peter Iredale and all that.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so we had a van and we went. There was a place where vehicles could enter. There was, a lot of sand there, fairly soft sand.
Uh-oh.
And the van went into the sand and stopped and stayed there, got stuck. And they actually tell you that the state parks people are like, if you get stuck in the sand, we're not coming to help you. But they have like a Facebook page that you can go to and say, hey, I'm stuck in the sand. Come help,
Well, there are a lot of ship captains that wish they had a Facebook page to log into when they got in trouble.
No kidding. So we ended up, our producer-director, Michael McClinton, he was driving the van, and so he had to figure out how to get it out. And volunteers came up. It was great. People came up and it got like high-boarded on the sand, so it took a lot of digging and all kinds of stuff. But in the meantime, we had a very limited window in which we could shoot on the beach. So the crew we all had to schlep, I don't know, maybe a quarter of a mile, maybe more, up the beach to the wreck and then do the shoot up there while we could see in the distance this crowd of people trying to get the van unstuck. We also had another shoot to do that day and a limited time there, so we needed to get it out by a certain time in order to make the other the other setup. So yeah, adventures in experiencing the shifting sands. It turns out that there were four-wheel drive vehicles also getting stuck there. And apparently the sands had shifted just from the previous day and created something that was much more difficult to get through. So it was unanticipated and pretty funny, actually.
So how did you get out eventually?
Well, between the digging and shoveling and all that, and eventually we were able to, somebody came along and could haul it out with a rope, and they were on a kind of a paved thing that came down to where the sand began, so like a boat launch type of thing. And so they were able to get us free.
Knut, what was the deadliest shipwreck that we know of?
Well, it wasn't a ship per se. It was lots of little boats. And this was something I actually came across after we did the episode. And in 1880, the canning industry had developed along the Columbia River. Of course, Astoria was the center of that, but there were canneries on both sides of the river. Millions upon millions of salmon are coming through. They're collecting them, fishing for them, and canning them and sending them, all over the place. The canneries had boats, fishing boats, small boats, hundreds of them, and fishermen working for the canneries would go out to the mouth of the Columbia. They would go out to the bar. They would go beyond the bar into the Pacific coast. And what they would do is they would let the current of the river take them out to the bar. And then when the tide came in, they'd let that push them back home, basically. Well, in 1880, there was a huge gale that came up. And between the tide and the current, it swept a bunch of boats out that then couldn't get back in because the tide hadn't turned. And the estimates were from 100 boats up to 200 to 300 people.
Oh, wow.
Just disappeared, just vanished. So hundreds of people died. Some of them washed ashore. There are accounts in the newspapers of people finding the bodies of guys who were alive when they went into the water and, died of hypothermia or drowning. And nobody knew what the true number was. This put me in mind of a family story in my own heritage. My great-grandfather lived in Scotland in a little fishing village in the north of Scotland, Hopeman. And he was a fisherman, as were his children and grandchildren, and it goes on, multi-generations of fishermen. And he and a boat from his village were fishing down in England on the east coast there, in the North Sea. And there was a big fleet of these small boats. This is 1891, so it's the same basic time period. And they are caught in this incredible gale that starts. I found a headline. This is from an American newspaper, by the way. This storm was so big, it was covered. Mm-hmm. Wreck and ruin, terrible gale sweeping England. Vessel after vessel is wrecked along the coast. Loss of life, something terrible to contemplate. It's the same kind of thing. And so my great-grandfather's vessel was one of those caught. They were trying to get to shore. They were swamped. They had a load of herring. Basically, everybody went into the water except a couple guys. And 6 of them were drowned, including my great-grandfather. And, of course, this had a huge impact on the family. It had a huge impact on why my grandmother emigrated to Canada and then the United States. So one of the interesting things about it is that there were accounts in the newspaper of the volunteer lifeboat people who worked in places like Lowestoft, which was a port and would row out in these storms to rescue the sailors. And that happened in this case. These guys rowed out to try and save my great-grandfather and his fellow crewmen, and he was almost saved. The family story is that a guy had a hold of him and he slipped and went under.
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
Wow. Are there still boats lost? Is this still a very common experience at the mouth of the Columbia?
Well, it's changed a lot for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is the technology is so different. We have weather reports,
Sure.
We have sonar, we have radar, we have all kinds of ways, navigational things. There are still professional pilots that bring big ships in and out. If you go down to Astoria, you'll see these vast container ships and whatnot. The bar is dredged, so they get rid of some of the hazards that way. But there are also these great jetties that have been built on the north-south, and there's one that runs north-south. And the purpose was both to calm the mouth of the Columbia so it wasn't so turbulent, and also to prevent sand from building up in the shipping lane there. So there's much more success in a thriving, business of commerce going in and out of the Columbia, and that's evident when you go down there. You see that. But yeah, you still see stories of people going out in pleasure boats, and there was a story that happened in just in the last couple of years where there was a guy who was trying to make some kind of a getaway and took a cabin cruiser and went out there, and there's YouTube videos of this guy in a very large pleasure boat, and this thing's just being tossed around like it's a little toy, and the Coast Guard comes and saves the day.
So they sent Petty Officer 3rd Class Branch Walton, a rescue swimmer, to carry out the mission.
They managed to pluck him out of the water and take him to safety, and it's worth watching just because it gives you a sense of that cauldron effect.
When I came up, I noticed that the boat was pretty much in shambles and kind of split in two.
And, how somebody, particularly somebody who's incautious or clueless, can get into trouble so quickly.
Let's talk about Astoria. I've been there several times, and I always find it to be full of character, a very salty place, has not become sort of the gift shop town that a lot of seaport tourist towns become.
I've been down there a number of times also, and over the years, and you're right, it hasn't been completely touristized.
Gussified.
Gussified, I love that word. However, there are a lot of people from Portland that have moved in. They've opened some really great restaurants. There are a lot of microbrews there. Microbreweries.
And there are a lot of artists and, it seems, writers. There are bookstores. It really has that literary flavor as well.
It does, but it used to be Astoria was just sort of the gateway to the Oregon coast if you were coming from Washington or coming from the east, and people kind of tended to ignore it. It was a very blue-collar town with the lumber industry, the fishing industry. This is a place you come to and it's like, yeah, the kind of cliches of the Northwest are still alive there.
I think you'd fit right in.
It'd be a city I'd consider moving to at some point. Yeah, no, it's very appealing. And one of the things that really got me, so I did a couple of different stories, one for Crosscut and for the Astorian newspaper down there, about the Fisher Poets Gathering, which happens every February. So this is the off-season for fishermen in the Northwest, by and large. And many of them from Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and you get them California, and even England, people will come. And these guys and gals have written poetry about the fishing business and about their lives and stuff. And when I was researching one of the articles, there had just been a brawl at a bar in Astoria between loggers and fishermen.
Of course.
And it's like, where else in these days? Is there a brawl between Microsofties and Amazon employees? We don't get that kind of, version of the old Northwest, but there's still an element of it in Astoria. You can smell it, you can feel it, you can see it. And then the other thing they have is the Goonies house.
Oh, of course. Did you go to the Goonies house?
We went to the Goonies house. That was just sort of a trip because it's such a touchstone, especially like for millennials, kids that grew up watching that movie. It's a big deal. It takes place in Astoria. And from the Goonies house, we could hear the sea lions barking. The wind was carrying in the kind of woof, 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 of the sea lions. And that's just, again, part of the atmosphere. I mean, they get thousands of sea lions there colonizing the docks and making this kind of song. I think if you wanted to point to a place that, kind of go get a taste of the old Northwest, that would be a place I would recommend.
All we need is a sea shanty right now.
Yeah, and a good pint of ale.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 10th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you'd like to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, and the in-depth reporting we deliver every day. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport, with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for the exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.